Leo will change nothing. The old Mass remains exactly as it is. This is the first voice, and it belongs to the Cardinal who governs the liturgical life of the entire Catholic Church. I don't know how well I know the Holy Father's mind. This is the second voice, and it arrived only hours later. Two men of the Church answering the same underlying question and delivering two completely opposing interpretations. And sitting in the middle of the two of them, a detail that makes this entire scene considerably more striking than a simple disagreement between two churchmen with different opinions. By the end of this video, you will have both positions laid out in full, with their actual arguments intact, and the conclusion will be left entirely up to you. Begin with the first voice, the one that opened this particular controversy. This is Cardinal Arthur Roche, Prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship, the Vatican office that oversees liturgical discipline across the Universal Church. In an interview with the British Catholic weekly The Tablet, published on July 29, 2026, Roche was categorical. He stated that Leo XIV will not change Traditionis Custodes and will not return to the framework established by Summorum Pontificum. Translated into plain terms, the existing restrictions on the ancient Mass remain fully in place. Anyone hoping for a meaningful opening under the new pontificate, he suggested, should adjust their expectations accordingly. And he offered his reasoning alongside the announcement itself. The Reformed Rite, he argued, makes the Church more genuinely missionary in her outward orientation. It offers, in his assessment, a greater richness of sacred scripture within the liturgy itself. It values the participation of the baptized faithful who celebrate together with the priest rather than as passive observers of something happening at a distance from them. This is, on its own terms, a coherent and well-reasoned position, and it deserves to be acknowledged honestly as such, rather than dismissed out of hand. Those who share Roche's view generally believe that having a single common liturgical form guarantees ecclesial unity, and that the multiplication of approved forms carries a real risk of fragmenting that unity over time. Coming from the Cardinal specifically responsible for liturgical discipline, this statement had every appearance of being the final and authoritative word on the matter. And yet the very next day, a second and entirely different voice entered the conversation. On July 30th, Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco appeared on Raymond Arroyo's Catholic television program and said, essentially, the exact opposite. Before reporting his actual words, one specific fact carries considerable weight and needs to be established clearly. Cordileone had been appointed by the Pope himself only days earlier as a new member of the Apostolic Signatura, the Church's supreme judicial tribunal. He is therefore not a marginal or isolated voice speaking from outside any position of institutional authority. He is an archbishop recently and personally elevated by Leo XIV to one of the highest judicial offices that exist anywhere within the structure of the Catholic Church. And this specific archbishop stated, in essentially direct terms, that maintaining the current restrictions on the ancient Mass is unrealistic. He was careful in how he framed this. He did not describe the restrictions as unjust in some abstract theoretical sense. He described them, more specifically and more practically, as unsustainable given the actual facts on the ground. The reason he offered was empirical rather than theoretical. The attraction young people feel toward the traditional liturgy, he said, is unstoppable. His words on this point were direct and unambiguous. This is what is attracting young people, he said, and it will continue to attract them. Look at the younger generation, he continued. Everyone loves tradition. Then came the specific sentence that spread across Catholic media within hours of the interview airing. When asked directly about Cardinal Roche's statements to the tablet, Cordileone responded, "I don't know how well I understand the mind of the Holy Father." A sentence carefully measured in its phrasing, but extremely weighty in what it actually implies. It amounts to publicly and openly questioning whether the prefect responsible for liturgical discipline is genuinely interpreting the Pope's actual intentions correctly, coming from a man the same Pope had just elevated to the Church's highest court. But immediately following that specific line, Cordileone added something further that deserves to be reported with equal precision, because it completes and considerably nuances the full picture rather than simply escalating the confrontation. He said that one thing seemed clear to him, and to everyone paying attention. The Holy Father wants to unite everyone. His goal, Cordileone insisted, is genuine unity across the Church. Cordileone is not, in other words, setting the Pope himself against Cardinal Roche. He is questioning specifically whether Roche's particular reading of the Pope's mind is the correct one, while affirming his own confidence in the Pope's underlying intention. And he added a further and genuinely concrete pastoral concern, perhaps the single most interesting element of the entire interview. It concerns the actual practical consequences of maintaining the current restrictions exactly as they stand. If the restrictions remain in place and continue to be rigidly enforced, he warned, many faithful Catholics will conclude they have no remaining option within full communion, and they will turn instead toward communities and groups that are not in full communion with Rome. This is a subject that deserves real and sustained attention precisely because it is not fundamentally about liturgical taste or aesthetic preference. It concerns real people and where they will actually end up as a direct consequence of specific policy choices made at the highest levels of Church governance. It is a matter of pastoral governance, in other words, not a matter of nostalgic sentiment to be indulged or dismissed according to personal preference. And in fact, Cordileone is not calling for anything to be formally abolished or for Traditionis Custodes to be discarded entirely. He is asking, quite specifically and quite literally, for easier access to the traditional liturgy, arguing that this can be managed responsibly, with appropriate precautions and pastoral care, without genuinely disrupting the broader unity of the Church. This is a genuinely balanced and measured proposal rather than an ultimatum or a call for confrontation, which makes it considerably more striking that it was formulated in such open and public disagreement with the very Vatican official directly responsible for this specific area of Church governance. Here, then, are the two images finally placed directly beside one another, exactly as they emerged within the space of a single 24-hour period. On one side, the restrictions serve the unity of the Church and will therefore remain firmly in place, according to the Cardinal, whose office is specifically charged with liturgical discipline. On the other side, those same restrictions are described as unrealistic and carry a genuine risk of alienating faithful Catholics from full communion altogether, according to an archbishop the Pope had just personally elevated to the Church's highest court. These two positions cannot both be entirely and simultaneously true in the fullest sense. Either the current ban genuinely holds the Church together as its defenders claim, or it is actively pushing segments of the faithful toward new and potentially permanent fractures, as its critics warn. This is precisely where these two accounts collide directly with one another. And there is one specific point where the contradiction becomes even sharper and more difficult to reconcile, and that is the question of the Pope's own actual intentions. One churchman claims, in effect, to know with confidence what Leo XIV will do regarding this policy. The other explicitly doubts whether that claimed knowledge is genuinely well-founded. The underlying fact, verifiable and beyond dispute, is that the Pope himself has not signed any new document addressing this specific question. He has made no formal public statement on it. His actual intentions, as matters currently stand, remain officially undeclared, which means that both Roche and Cordileone are, in the most precise sense, offering their own interpretations rather than reporting settled fact. One expects continued policy continuity. The other expects eventual openness and reform. Neither currently has an official document to point to in support of his specific reading. And this, perhaps, is the single most significant dimension of this entire episode, worth sitting with carefully rather than rushing past. Two senior figures near the very top of the Church's governing structure, interpreting the same still unfolding pontificate in genuinely opposite directions, and choosing to say so publicly, rather than working out their disagreement through private channels alone. This is not a minor stylistic difference between two men who otherwise substantially agree. It is a real and consequential disagreement about the actual direction of church governance on a question that directly affects the daily spiritual lives of a very large number of Catholics worldwide. It is also worth dwelling on another element of this exchange that has received considerably less attention than it probably deserves. Neither man, in his own public statements, denies the validity or the inherent dignity of the liturgical form the other prefers. Roche does not say the ancient Mass is somehow bad or spiritually deficient. He maintains instead that the Church's common liturgical form should remain singular and unified. Cordileone, for his part, does not attack or diminish the Reformed Rite in any way. He simply calls for genuinely easier access to the older Rite alongside it. The actual disagreement between them, therefore, is not fundamentally about the intrinsic value of either specific liturgy considered on its own terms. It is about a more practical and genuinely difficult governance question. How much liturgical plurality can the Church actually sustain internally without risking a more serious fracture in her visible unity? And on that specific question, these two men, both currently serving in positions of real institutional authority within the Church, simply and openly disagree with one another. There is also the shared fact that both men, whatever their disagreement about what should be done in response to it, ultimately acknowledge the same underlying reality, even as they evaluate its significance quite differently. Young people, by every available measure, are increasingly moving toward the traditional liturgy rather than away from it. This is a measurable and documented trend rather than a matter of personal opinion or anecdotal impression. For Cordileone, that specific fact functions as the primary reason to widen access and lower the existing barriers. For those who share Roche's broader institutional perspective, that same fact instead requires that this genuine spiritual hunger be carefully channeled into the single common liturgical form, through catechesis, formation, and pastoral patience, rather than accommodated through an expansion of separate liturgical options. The same underlying reality, acknowledged by both sides, produces two genuinely opposite proposed strategies for responding to it. And so the entire controversy, when it is finally traced back to its actual root, comes down to a single question that neither Cardinal Roche nor Archbishop Cordileone has managed to fully resolve, and that the wider Church herself has never resolved with permanent finality across her entire 2,000-year history. What truly holds a Church together? Is it uniformity of liturgical form, a single common way of worshipping shared by every Catholic everywhere regardless of local custom or historical development? Or is it something deeper and less visible than form itself, a genuine communion in the substance of the faith that can, under the right conditions, accommodate real diversity in how that faith is liturgically expressed? This is an ancient question. The Church has asked it many times across many centuries, in many different historical circumstances, and she has given different answers depending on the specific pressures and needs of each particular era. There is no single automatic or self-evident solution waiting to be discovered that settles the question permanently for every future generation. It is worth noting as a matter of simple historical and canonical fact, rather than as an argument for either side of this specific dispute, that the Catholic Church today already contains numerous distinct liturgical rites existing simultaneously and in full communion with one another. The various Eastern Catholic churches, in communion with Rome while maintaining their own ancient liturgical traditions, their own languages, their own liturgical calendars, and their own distinct customs that differ substantially from the Latin Rite in both form and theological emphasis, have coexisted within visible Catholic unity for centuries without anyone seriously arguing that this liturgical plurality itself constitutes a threat to the Church's fundamental unity. A Maronite Catholic and a Ukrainian Greek Catholic and a Roman Catholic all recognize one another fully as fellow Catholics in complete communion, despite worshipping according to liturgical forms that differ from one another considerably more, in many respects, than the traditional Latin Mass differs from the Reformed Roman Rite. Those who defend the current restrictions on the ancient Latin Mass, however, offer a specific and serious counterargument to this comparison, one that deserves to be represented fairly rather than dismissed. They argue that the Eastern Catholic rites represent genuinely distinct and ancient liturgical traditions, each with its own independent historical development, stretching back through entirely separate ecclesial lineages, rather than two competing forms of what is, at bottom, the very same Roman Rite. The difference between the Latin Mass and the Reformed Roman Missal, on this specific argument, is not comparable to the difference between the Latin Rite and the Byzantine Rite, because the former represents a single liturgical tradition that was deliberately reformed by the same central authority, while the latter represents genuinely separate traditions that developed independently and were never meant to be unified into a single common form in the first place. This is a real and substantive argument, not merely a rhetorical deflection, and it deserves to be weighed honestly alongside the comparison to the Eastern rites, rather than dismissed as an inconsistency on the part of those who maintain the current restrictions. What emerges from placing these two positions honestly side by side, then, is not a simple story with an obvious villain and an obvious hero, however tempting it might be for commentary on either side of this debate to construct one. It is a genuine and serious disagreement between two men who both hold real institutional authority within the Church, who both, in their own ways, claim to be acting out of concern for the Church's unity and the good of souls, and who have arrived at genuinely opposite conclusions about what actually serves that shared goal in the concrete circumstances of the present moment. Cardinal Roche's position carries the weight of his specific institutional responsibility. He is the man Rome has charged with overseeing liturgical discipline across the entire universal Church, and his argument that a single common liturgical form best serves ecclesial unity reflects a genuine and long-standing strand of Catholic ecclesiological thought, one that has real historical precedent behind it. including periods in church history when liturgical uniformity was specifically pursued as a tool for consolidating unity during moments of internal division or external threat. His confidence that Leo XIV will maintain continuity with the Francis-era restrictions may prove accurate, and if it does, it will not be because Roche invented that policy out of personal preference, but because he is accurately reading the actual direction the current pontificate has thus far chosen not to reverse. Archbishop Cordileone's position, meanwhile, carries the weight of direct pastoral experience with the specific population of Catholics most affected by these restrictions, combined with the institutional weight of his own recent and very public elevation to the Church's highest court by the very Pope whose intentions are in dispute. His warning that rigid enforcement of the current restrictions risks pushing faithful Catholics toward communities outside full communion is not a hypothetical concern invented for rhetorical effect. It reflects a pattern this channel has documented repeatedly and extensively in recent months. From the growth of Society of St. Pius X communities in dioceses that have restricted the ancient Mass most severely, to the specific and well-documented case of a Scottish bishop who chose to expand traditional Mass access precisely because he recognized that restriction alone, without a genuine and generous alternative offered within full communion, tends to drive the faithful toward the margins rather than back toward the center. Neither man is asking for anything approaching a genuine ecclesiastical rupture. This point deserves to be stated with real clarity, because it is easily lost amid the drama of a viral quote about not knowing the Pope's mind. Roche is not calling for the ancient Mass to be eliminated entirely or declared invalid. Cordileone is not calling for Traditionis Custodes to be abolished outright, or for a return to some kind of unrestricted liturgical free-for-all. Both men are operating, in their own ways, within the bounds of legitimate and good faith disagreement about pastoral prudence, a disagreement the Catholic tradition has always permitted among her bishops, precisely because bishops bear genuine personal responsibility before God for the flocks entrusted specifically to their own care. A responsibility that does not simply evaporate the moment another department of the Curia announces a general policy. What makes this particular disagreement genuinely newsworthy, rather than simply one more entry in a now familiar pattern of competing Catholic voices on the traditional Mass question, is the specific institutional weight both men currently carry, and the fact that they chose to air this disagreement so openly and so publicly within a single 24-hour period, rather than working it out through the more customary internal and private channels the Curia has traditionally preferred for resolving exactly this kind of disagreement among senior churchmen. A prefect of a major dicastery and a newly appointed judge of the Church's Supreme Tribunal, disagreeing openly and on the public record about what the reigning Pope actually intends to do, is not a routine occurrence in the ordinary functioning of Vatican governance. It signals, at minimum, that the underlying question itself remains genuinely unresolved at the highest levels of the Church, whatever confidence either individual voice projects in his own particular reading of the situation. The faithful Catholics actually caught in the middle of this disagreement, the families driving considerable distances to attend an increasingly limited number of approved traditional Masses, the young converts and young cradle Catholics, whom Cordileone specifically identified as being drawn toward the ancient liturgy in growing numbers, deserve something more durable than dueling media interviews from senior churchmen interpreting an undeclared papal intention in opposite directions. They deserve, eventually, actual clarity from the only person whose word on this specific question carries genuinely decisive authority, the Pope himself. Until that clarity arrives, in the form of an actual document or an actual formal statement, rather than competing interpretations offered second-hand through interviews, both Cardinal Roche and Archbishop Cordileone remain, in the most precise and honest sense, exactly what this video has described them as being throughout. Two senior churchmen, each speaking in good faith according to his own genuine convictions, each claiming some insight into the mind of a pope who has not yet spoken plainly and directly on this question himself. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.